Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we drift into the shadowed streets of New York, where loyalty was currency and power preferred to stay unseen. This is the world of Joe Profaci, a man guided by patience rather than impulse, where influence was cultivated quietly, not seized loudly, and every decision was measured years ahead. Most people couldn't endure a life like this, not because it was loud or chaotic, but because it demanded restraint, discipline, and the ability to wait while others rushed toward their own mistakes. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's darker corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the city noise fade, and settle in as we ease into the quiet, calculating story of Joe Profaci. The ship pulled into New York Harbor in 1921, and among the hundreds of immigrants crowding the deck, one young man stood apart. Not in appearance, Giuseppe Profaci looked like countless other Italian arrivals, wearing a cheap suit and carrying everything he owned in a single battered suitcase. What set him apart was the look in his eyes. While others stared at the Statue of Liberty with hope mixed with fear, Giuseppe looked at the skyline of New York City like a general surveying territory he intended to conquer. He was 24 years old, and within 3 decades, he would control one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America. But unlike other mob bosses who ruled through violence and intimidation, Giuseppe, who would soon become known as Joe Profaci, would build his empire on something unexpected: legitimacy, or at least the appearance of it. This is the story of a man who understood something that most criminals never grasp. The key to lasting power isn't just taking what you want through force. It's making people believe you're not a criminal at all. It's building a facade so convincing that you can operate in plain sight, shaking hands with politicians and priests while running an organization that controls everything from the docks to the bakeries to the funeral homes. Joe Profaci would become known as the Olive Oil King, a respected businessman and philanthropist who gave generously to the Catholic Church and Italian-American charities. But behind that carefully constructed image was a criminal mastermind who ran one of New York's 5 families with an iron fist wrapped in velvet gloves. Giuseppe Profaci was born on October 2, 1897, in Villabate, a small town in Sicily, just outside Palermo. This detail is crucial to understanding everything that came after, because Sicily wasn't just Joe's birthplace. It was the source code for everything he believed about power, loyalty, and how the world really worked. Sicily had been conquered and ruled by outsiders for centuries. Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Normans, Spanish, French. Everyone had taken their turn controlling the island. And the Sicilian people had learned to survive by developing their own parallel systems of power and justice. The mafia, or Cosa Nostra as insiders called it, had evolved over centuries as a shadow government. When the official government was corrupt or absent, when the police couldn't or wouldn't protect you, when the courts were a joke, you turned to the local mafia boss. He could settle disputes, provide protection, deliver justice. Of course, all of this came at a price, and the mafia was itself deeply corrupt and violent. But it was a system that made sense to people who'd learned not to trust official authority. Young Giuseppe grew up immersed in this culture. His family wasn't wealthy, but they weren't desperately poor either. His father worked hard, and the family maintained their dignity and their place in the community. But Giuseppe could see the reality around him. The people with real power weren't the ones working honest jobs. They were the ones who understood how to navigate both the legitimate world and the shadow world, who could operate in both spheres simultaneously. Sicily in the early 1900s was also a place of limited opportunity. The island was poor, overpopulated, and controlled by a small elite. For ambitious young men like Giuseppe, there were really only 2 choices: accept a life of limited prospects in Sicily, or take a chance on America. Millions of Italians made that choice, and Giuseppe was among them. But Giuseppe didn't come to America as a desperate refugee hoping for any opportunity. He came with connections, with plans, with an understanding of how the system worked. Through family and regional ties, he was already connected to people in the Sicilian criminal network who'd established themselves in New York. These connections would prove invaluable. When Giuseppe arrived in New York in 1921, the city was in the midst of transformation. Prohibition had just begun, making the production and sale of alcohol illegal. This created an enormous criminal opportunity. Americans wanted to drink, and they'd pay substantial money for alcohol despite, or perhaps because of, its illegal status. Organized crime groups moved quickly to capitalize, establishing bootlegging operations that would generate unprecedented profits. Giuseppe settled in Brooklyn, in an Italian neighborhood where Sicilian dialects were spoken on every corner, where the social structure resembled the villages of the old country. He started small, working various jobs, making connections, learning how the American criminal underworld operated. It was similar to Sicily in many ways, but also different. America was bigger, richer, more chaotic. The opportunities were vast if you knew how to seize them. Giuseppe anglicized his name to Joe Profaci, understanding that success in America required at least a veneer of assimilation. But he maintained his Sicilian identity and connections. In the mob world, your regional origin mattered enormously. Sicilians stuck together, trusted each other more than they trusted mainland Italians, or certainly anyone from outside Italian culture. Joe's Sicilian background opened doors, provided introductions, established his bona fides with the criminals who were organizing bootlegging operations. But Joe didn't want to just be a soldier in someone else's organization. He had bigger ambitions, and he understood something crucial. The most successful criminals weren't the most violent or the most daring. They were the ones who built legitimate businesses that could serve as fronts for illegal activities and as vehicles for laundering criminal profits. Joe's chosen vehicle was olive oil. It was perfect for several reasons. First, the Italian-American community consumed enormous quantities of olive oil. It was essential to their cuisine, their identity. Second, importing olive oil from Italy provided opportunities for smuggling and for creating false business records. Third, running an import business gave Joe a legitimate reason to travel, to have connections to Italy, to move money internationally. Joe started the Mamma Mia Importing Company, initially operating on a small scale, importing olive oil and other Italian food products. He was hands-on, learning every aspect of the business, building relationships with suppliers in Italy and customers in America. And the business was actually legitimate, at least partly. Joe really did import olive oil and sell it to retailers and restaurants. The business made money, paid taxes, operated openly. But the olive oil business also provided cover for criminal activities. Shipments could contain more than just olive oil. Business trips to Italy could include meetings with mafia associates. The company's financial records could be manipulated to hide income from illegal sources. It was brilliant in its simplicity, hiding criminal activity inside a functioning legitimate business. Through the 1920s, Joe built both his legal business and his criminal operations simultaneously. He got involved in bootlegging, working with established criminal groups to import and distribute illegal alcohol. He made connections with mafia families in other cities, establishing himself as a reliable businessman who could move product, launder money, and handle complex operations. Joe also got married during this period. His wife Ninfa came from a respectable Italian family. They had children, bought a house in a nice Brooklyn neighborhood, attended church regularly. From the outside, Joe Profaci looked like a successful Italian-American businessman living the American dream. He was friendly, generous in the community, known as someone who helped people out when they needed it. But behind this facade, Joe was building a criminal organization. He recruited people carefully, mostly Sicilians from the same region he came from, people whose families he knew, whose loyalty he could count on. He established rackets, illegal gambling, loan sharking, labor union corruption. He developed a reputation as someone who was smart, careful, and who understood that discretion was more valuable than flashiness. The bootlegging era was incredibly profitable, but also incredibly violent. Different criminal groups competed for territory and market share. Disagreements turned into gun battles. Law enforcement, despite being widespread corrupt, occasionally cracked down. Many bootleggers ended up dead or in prison. Joe navigated this dangerous landscape carefully, avoiding the most violent confrontations, making strategic alliances, staying below the radar of law enforcement attention. In 1928, Joe made a move that would prove crucial to his future. He aligned himself with Joe Masuria, one of the most powerful mafia bosses in New York. Masuria was old school, a mustache Pete who believed in traditional Sicilian values and methods. But he was also enormously powerful, controlling a large criminal organization and commanding respect throughout the underworld. By aligning with Masuria, Joe Profaci gained protection and legitimacy within the criminal hierarchy. He was no longer just an independent operator. He was part of a major organization with all the benefits and obligations that entailed. He had to kick up money to Masuria, had to follow Masuria's orders, had to participate in the organization's activities. But in return, he had backing, had access to opportunities, had a place in the power structure. The late 1920s in New York's underworld were marked by growing tension between the old guard and a new generation of mobsters who wanted to change how things worked. Joe Masuria represented the traditional way, territorial, insular, dominated by Sicilian-born bosses who looked down on mainland Italians and refused to work with non-Italian criminals. But younger mobsters like Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Meyer Lansky had a different vision. They believed the future lay in cooperation across ethnic lines, in treating organized crime like a business rather than a blood feud, in maximizing profits rather than settling old country grudges. Joe Profaci found himself in an interesting position. He was Sicilian to his core, believed in many of the old traditions, and had aligned himself with Masuria. But he was also a pragmatist who understood that the younger generation had valid points. The constant warfare between different factions was bad for business. The refusal to work with talented criminals from other backgrounds was limiting. The old ways were being challenged not just by young hotheads but by changing realities. The conflict came to a head in what became known as the Castellamarese War, named after the Sicilian town of Castellammare del Golfo. The war pitted Joe Masuria against Salvatore Maranzano, another powerful Sicilian boss who'd recently arrived in America. Both men wanted to be the boss of bosses, to control New York's Italian underworld. And both demanded that other criminals choose sides.
Joe Profaci chose carefully.
Initially, he stayed with Masuria, honoring his earlier alliance. But as the war progressed through 1930 and into 1931, Joe began to see which way the wind was blowing. The younger generation, particularly Lucky Luciano, who was nominally part of Masuria's organization, was quietly planning to eliminate both old guard bosses and establish a new order. On April 15, 1931, Joe Masuria was killed in a restaurant in Coney Island. He was shot multiple times while eating lunch, assassinated by gunmen who included several of his own men who'd betrayed him. Lucky Luciano had arranged the hit, working with other young mobsters who wanted to end the old guard leadership. Joe Profaci had known the hit was coming. Whether he was directly involved or simply aware and chose not to warn Masuria is unclear from historical records. What's certain is that Joe survived the transition when many of Masuria's loyalists didn't. This wasn't luck. Joe had been positioning himself, making sure the younger generation saw him as someone they could work with, someone who understood the new reality. But the reorganization wasn't complete. Salvatore Maranzano, who'd won the Castellamarese War with Masuria's death, now tried to establish himself as the boss of bosses. He organized New York's Italian criminals into 5 families, each with its own territory and leadership. This structure would persist for decades. But Maranzano also began planning to eliminate potential rivals, including Lucky Luciano. Luciano struck first. On September 10, 1931, just months after Masuria's death, Maranzano was killed in his office by gunmen posing as federal agents. This time, there was no question about Joe Profaci's position. He was part of the new order being established, one of the leaders who would control the reorganized structure. The new system eliminated the concept of a boss of bosses. Instead, the 5 families would operate independently but cooperatively. They'd settle disputes through a commission, a kind of board of directors made up of the bosses from the most powerful families. The families would respect each other's territories, wouldn't interfere in each other's internal affairs, and would work together on ventures that required coordination. Joe Profaci was named boss of one of the 5 families. At 34 years old, having been in America for only 10 years, He'd risen to the absolute top of the criminal hierarchy. The family he controlled was initially the smallest of the five, but it was his. He had autonomy to run it as he saw fit, as long as he respected the rules of the commission and maintained good relations with the other bosses. Joe's family controlled territory in Brooklyn, particularly in the Italian neighborhoods where Joe had established himself. They ran the traditional mob rackets, illegal gambling, loan sharking, labor union corruption, extortion. But Joe also emphasized legitimate business as a cover and as a source of legal income. The olive oil business continued to grow. Joe invested in other ventures, bakeries, restaurants, funeral homes, real estate. Joe's approach to running his family was methodical and conservative. He didn't take unnecessary risks. He didn't engage in flashy violence that would attract media and law enforcement attention. He demanded absolute loyalty but also took care of his people. Members of his family could count on help when they needed it, bail money if arrested, support for their families if they went to prison, connections for legitimate jobs if they wanted to go straight. But Joe also demanded what he considered his due. He required his capos and soldiers to pay him regular tribute, a percentage of their earnings. This was standard practice in all the families, but Joe was particularly strict about it. Some members grumbled that Joe took too much, that he was greedy. But Joe saw it differently. He was the boss, he provided the protection and structure that allowed them to operate, and he deserved to be compensated for that. Joe's relationship with the Catholic Church became increasingly important during the 1930s. He was genuinely religious, attended Mass regularly, made substantial donations to churches and Catholic charities. His donations bought him respect in the Italian-American community and provided excellent public relations. Who would believe that this generous benefactor, this pillar of the community who funded orphanages and helped build churches, was actually a mafia boss? The church, for its part, accepted Joe's donations without asking too many questions about where the money came from. This was common in immigrant communities. The church needed money to operate, and if some of that money came from people involved in questionable activities, well, that was between them and God. The church's acceptance of Joe's donations gave him a veneer of respectability that was invaluable. In 1933, Prohibition ended. The repeal of the 18th Amendment eliminated the enormous profits from bootlegging that had financed the growth of organized crime in the 1920s. Many criminals struggled to replace that income, but Joe had prepared for this. His legitimate businesses were already established and profitable. His other rackets, gambling, loan sharking, labor corruption, didn't depend on prohibition. The transition was difficult for many mobsters, but Joe navigated it successfully. Through the 1930s, Joe consolidated his control over his family and expanded his operations. He developed relationships with politicians, ensuring that he had friends in positions where they could help him. A word from the right politician could make a legal problem disappear, could ensure that a business license was approved, could provide advance warning about investigations. Joe understood that corrupting government officials wasn't just about bribery. It was about building relationships, doing favors, creating networks of mutual obligation. Joe's family wasn't the most violent of the five families, but they weren't pushovers either. When force was necessary, Joe didn't hesitate to use it. Members who betrayed the family were dealt with harshly. Outsiders who encroached on family territory were warned and, if warnings weren't heeded, were taught lessons they wouldn't forget. Joe believed in measured violence, enough to maintain respect and control, but not so much that it attracted unwanted attention. During this period, Joe also established connections with mafia organizations in other cities. The American Mafia wasn't just a New York phenomenon. There were powerful families in Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, New Orleans, Los Angeles, and other cities. These families cooperated on certain ventures and had to coordinate on issues that crossed territorial boundaries. Joe developed relationships with bosses in other cities, particularly with Sicilian bosses who shared his background and values. One of Joe's innovations was the way he structured legitimate businesses within his criminal organization. Rather than keeping legal and illegal activities completely separate, Joe integrated them. The same people who ran his gambling operations might also work in his legitimate companies. Money from illegal activities was invested in legal businesses, then extracted as apparently legitimate income. This made it difficult for law enforcement to untangle what was legal from what wasn't. Joe's olive oil business continued to thrive. By the late 1930s, Mamma Mia Importing Company was one of the largest olive oil importers in the United States. The company had warehouses, distribution networks, sales representatives. It employed dozens of people, many of them family members or associates. The business generated substantial legitimate income, which Joe reported to tax authorities and used to support his lifestyle. But the olive oil business also served criminal purposes. Shipments from Italy could include contraband hidden among legitimate products. The company's financial records could be manipulated to hide criminal income. Business trips to Italy provided opportunities for Joe to meet with Sicilian mafia leaders and coordinate international criminal activities. The legitimate business and the criminal enterprise were intertwined in ways that made them difficult to separate. Joe's personal life during this period appeared conventional and respectable. He lived with his wife and growing family in a nice house in Brooklyn. He was known in the neighborhood as a successful businessman, a good family man, someone who helped people out. He sponsored local sports teams, donated to community causes, attended church festivals. His children went to Catholic schools and were shielded from knowledge of their father's criminal activities. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, Joe was running a criminal organization that controlled significant portions of Brooklyn's economy. His family had their hands in construction, in the garment industry, in waste management, in food distribution. Any business operating in their territory either worked with them or faced problems. Labor unions in industries the family controlled were dominated by family associates who ensured that workers didn't cause trouble and that employers paid for labor peace. Joe's position on the commission gave him influence beyond just his own family. The commission met regularly to discuss issues affecting organized crime across New York and beyond. Disputes between families were mediated. New rackets were coordinated. Potential problems with law enforcement were discussed. Joe wasn't the most powerful voice on the commission. That belonged to bosses of larger families like the Genovese and Gambino families. But he was respected, his opinions were valued, and he had a vote on important decisions. The 1940s brought new challenges and opportunities for Joe Profaci and the American Mafia. World War II created disruptions in normal business but also opened new avenues for profit. The war effort required enormous quantities of supplies, and the mob was positioned to provide them, both legally and illegally. Black market goods, rationed items sold without coupons, stolen military supplies, all of these created income streams for organized crime. Joe's importing business proved particularly valuable during the war years. With legitimate trade disrupted by the conflict, there was enormous demand for imported goods, and the ability to navigate international commerce became even more valuable. Joe maintained his connections to Italy even as the country became America's enemy, working through neutral countries and using his criminal network to keep goods flowing. But Joe was also careful during this period. Anti-Italian sentiment ran high during the war, and Joe didn't want to be seen as unpatriotic or as someone with questionable loyalties. He made public displays of supporting the war effort, bought war bonds, had his photograph taken presenting donations to military charities. All of this was theater, designed to deflect attention and maintain his image as a legitimate businessman and loyal American. The Profaci family's criminal operations continued throughout the war, though with some adjustments. Gambling remained profitable, perhaps more so, as people sought escape from wartime stress. Loan sharking thrived as rationing and shortages created demand for cash among people who couldn't get credit through legitimate channels. Labor racketeering in war industries was particularly lucrative, as employers needed to maintain production and couldn't afford strikes or slowdowns. Joe also began positioning family members and trusted associates in key roles within his organization. His brother-in-law Joseph Magliocco became his underboss, the second-in-command who would run day-to-day operations when Joe was occupied with other matters. Having family in leadership positions ensured loyalty and kept control within a tight circle. This was standard practice in mafia families. Blood ties were considered more reliable than other relationships. After the war ended in 1945, the American economy boomed. Returning soldiers started families, bought houses, launched businesses. The Italian-American community, which had suffered discrimination and suspicion during the war, worked hard to prove their American credentials. Many second-generation Italian-Americans were moving up the economic ladder, getting educations, entering professions, leaving the old neighborhoods behind. Joe watched these changes with mixed feelings. On one hand, the success of Italian Americans was good for the community and reduced the prejudice that had made life difficult for immigrants like himself. On the other hand, as Italian Americans assimilated and prospered, they became less dependent on the mafias, services, and less willing to tolerate or support organized crime in their communities. Joe adapted by diversifying his operations. He moved beyond traditional neighborhood-based rackets into industries with broader reach. The Profaci family became heavily involved in the garment industry, which was concentrated in New York but served the entire country. They controlled unions, owned factories, and could influence everything from fabric suppliers to retail stores. This gave them both legitimate income and opportunities for traditional mob rackets like extortion and loan sharking. The family also expanded into waste management, which would become an enormously profitable mob-controlled industry. Garbage collection was a necessity, and the contracts were often awarded through political connections. The mob's ability to control unions meant they could threaten strikes if their companies didn't get contracts. Once they controlled the industry in certain areas, they could charge whatever rates they wanted and could use garbage trucks and landfills for disposing of evidence from crimes. Joe's legitimate businesses continued to grow. The olive oil company expanded, and Joe invested in other food-related businesses. He owned bakeries, pasta factories, importing companies. These businesses employed family members, provided jobs for associates, and generated legal income that helped explain Joe's visible wealth. Tax authorities might wonder how an immigrant who'd arrived with nothing had become wealthy, but Joe could point to his successful businesses as the source of his prosperity. Joe's relationship with the Catholic Church deepened during this period. He funded the construction of a new church in Brooklyn, donated an altar to another, and gave generously to various Catholic charities. The church reciprocated by treating Joe as a respected member of the community. Priests attended events at his home. He was given honors by Catholic organizations. His children were educated in Catholic schools where his donations ensured they received special attention. This relationship with the church wasn't purely cynical. Joe was genuinely religious in his own way. He saw no contradiction between his criminal activities and his Catholic faith. In his worldview, he was providing for his family, helping his community, and living according to values he'd learned in Sicily. The fact that he made money through illegal means was just a practical reality, not a moral failing. Many successful people bent or broke rules to get ahead. Joe just happened to operate in a sphere where the rules he was breaking were criminal laws rather than business regulations. Through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, Joe's position seemed secure. His family was stable and profitable. His relationships with other mob families were generally good. His legitimate businesses provided cover and income. His political connections protected him from serious law enforcement pressure. He'd achieved the American dream, albeit through criminal means. But there were growing problems beneath the surface. Some members of the Profaci family were becoming resentful of Joe's demands for tribute. Joe took a larger percentage of his members' earnings than bosses of other families, and he didn't reinvest as much back into supporting the family's operations. If a family member got arrested, Joe might help with bail and legal fees, but he expected to be repaid. Other bosses were more generous, treating such support as part of their obligations to their men. There was also resentment about Joe's lifestyle. He lived well, nice house, expensive cars, fine clothes. He spent money on religious donations and community causes. But family members saw little of that generosity. They were expected to earn and kick up their share, while Joe accumulated wealth. The traditional mafia expectation was that bosses would be generous with their men, would share the wealth, would take care of people. Joe's approach was more businesslike. You got what you earned, and he got his percentage as boss. These resentments were mostly suppressed during the early 1950s. Joe was the boss, he had absolute authority, and challenging him was dangerous. But the dissatisfaction was building, creating fractures that would eventually threaten Joe's control. Joe also faced external challenges. Law enforcement was beginning to take organized crime more seriously. J. Edgar Hoover, who'd long denied that the mafia even existed, was finally acknowledging the reality of organized crime and directing FBI resources toward investigating it. The 1950 Kefauver Committee hearings, which investigated organized crime nationally, had brought unprecedented public attention to the mafia. In 1957, a meeting of mob bosses from across the country in Appalachian, New York, was raided by police. Dozens of major organized crime figures were arrested or identified, proving beyond doubt the existence of a national criminal network. Joe Profaci was supposed to attend that meeting but had avoided going, a decision that saved him from being arrested with the others. This was typical of Joe's caution. He'd managed to avoid being publicly identified as a mob boss despite decades in that role. But the Appalachian raid changed everything. Law enforcement now knew who the bosses were, knew that they met and coordinated activities, knew that organized crime was a national phenomenon. The pressure on mob families increased dramatically. Wiretaps became more common.
Surveillance intensifie.
Prosecutors began building cases using new investigative techniques. Joe responded by becoming even more cautious. He limited his direct involvement in criminal activities, relying more heavily on underboss Joseph Magliocco and his capos to run operations. He communicated carefully, assuming phones were tapped and meetings were monitored. He maintained his legitimate business activities, which provided both income and cover. But Joe couldn't avoid all contact with his criminal organization. He still needed to meet with family members, to make decisions, to settle disputes. These meetings were held in carefully chosen locations, walk-and-talks in parks where conversations couldn't be recorded, social gatherings that appeared innocent, brief encounters that looked coincidental. The mob was adapting to increased law enforcement pressure, finding ways to operate despite surveillance. Joe's family life during this period remained outwardly conventional. His children were growing up, some getting married and starting families of their own. Joe was becoming a grandfather, a respected elder in his community. He attended family gatherings, celebrated holidays, participated in the rituals of Italian-American family life. To his grandchildren, he was just grandpa, a successful businessman who was generous with gifts and attention. But the younger generation of Profaci family members was becoming restless. The late 1950s was a period of change in America. The rigid hierarchies and traditions that Joe valued were being questioned. Young people wanted more opportunity, more voice in decisions, more of the profits. The old Sicilian ways, where the boss's word was law and questioning authority was unthinkable, were starting to seem outdated. In 1959, these tensions exploded into open conflict. A group of younger members of the Profaci family, led by the Gallo brothers, Larry, Albert, and Joseph, rebelled against Joe's leadership. They were tired of what they saw as Joe's greed, tired of kicking up huge percentages of their earnings while Joe lived like a king, tired of the old-fashioned ways. The Gallo brothers were ambitious, violent, and willing to challenge the established order. They kidnapped several of Joe's top associates, including underboss Joseph Magliocco, and demanded changes. They wanted Joe to reduce the tribute they owed him, wanted more autonomy in their operations, wanted respect and recognition for what they'd contributed to the family. Joe was shocked by this rebellion. In his worldview, such insubordination was unthinkable. He was the boss, appointed by the commission, operating according to mafia traditions that went back centuries. The Gallos weren't just challenging him personally, they were challenging the entire system of authority that the mafia depended on. The Gallo rebellion threw Joe Profaci's world into chaos. For the first time in nearly 3 decades as boss, his authority was being openly challenged by members of his own family. The kidnapping of his underboss and other key associates wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration of war. Joe had to respond decisively or risk appearing weak, which in the mafia world could be fatal. Weakness invited further challenges, and if Joe couldn't control his own family, the commission might decide he needed to be replaced. Joe's initial response was to try negotiation. Through intermediaries, he opened communications with the Gallo faction. The hostages were eventually released unharmed after several tense days, which some saw as a victory for the Gallos and a sign of Joe's weakness. But Joe was playing a longer game. He agreed to some of the Gallos' demands, reducing their tribute payments and granting them more autonomy. To the Gallos, this looked like success. They challenged the boss and forced him to back down. But Joe had no intention of honoring these agreements long-term. In his mind, the Gallos had committed an unforgivable offense. They'd violated the sacred code of respect for authority. They'd kidnapped made members of the family, which was against all mafia rules. They deserved death, not concessions. But Joe was patient. He would wait for the right moment, would lull the Gallos into believing they'd won, and then he would strike. The conflict that followed became known as the Gallo-Profaci War, though it was really a civil war within the Profaci family. Through the early 1960s, members aligned with either Joe or the Gallos engaged in a campaign of violence. Men were shot in the streets, found dead in cars, disappeared never to be seen again. The violence was bad for business, drew law enforcement attention, and damaged the family's operations. Joe directed the war from a distance, using loyalists to carry out attacks while maintaining his own appearance of respectability. He continued his legitimate business activities, continued his charitable donations, continued attending church. To outsiders, he was still the respectable businessman. Only those inside the mob world knew he was orchestrating a campaign to eliminate the rebels who challenged him. The other mob families watched the Profaci civil war with concern. Internal conflicts were bad for everyone. They disrupted criminal operations, attracted law enforcement attention, and could spill over into violence that affected other families' territories and operations. The commission tried to mediate, calling meetings between Joe and the Gallo faction, attempting to broker a lasting peace. But Joe wasn't interested in real peace. He participated in the mediation efforts, made promises of reconciliation, and then continued planning the elimination of the Gallo leadership. In Joe's worldview, you couldn't compromise with rebels. You had to destroy them completely or they'd rise up again. The only acceptable outcome was the Gallos' complete defeat or death. The war took a toll on Joe personally. The stress, combined with his advancing age, affected his health. Joe was in his 60s now, not the young man who'd arrived in America 4 decades earlier. He developed health problems, heart issues, high blood pressure, other ailments related to age and stress. His doctors advised him to reduce stress, to rest, to take it easy. But how could he rest when his authority was being challenged, when his family was at war? Through 1961 and into 1962, the violence continued. Several members of the Gallo faction were killed. Larry Gallo survived an attempted strangulation in a bar. Joey Gallo was arrested on various charges. The Profaci loyalists seemed to be winning the war through attrition. But the cost was high. Law enforcement pressure intensified. Legitimate businesses suffered from the distraction and violence, and the family's reputation was damaged. Joe's health deteriorated further. He was diagnosed with cancer in 1962, a devastating blow for a man who'd always been vigorous and in control. The cancer was serious, requiring treatment that left Joe weakened and sick. He had to reduce his direct involvement in family affairs, relying more heavily on underboss Joseph Magliocco to run daily operations. But even illness didn't soften Joe's determination to crush the Gallo rebellion. He continued directing strategy, approving operations, demanding updates on the war's progress. His hatred for the Gallos had become personal, almost obsessive. They challenged him, humiliated him by forcing concessions, damaged his family. They had to be destroyed, no matter what it cost. The commission grew increasingly frustrated with the ongoing conflict. In 1963, they essentially ordered both sides to stand down, to end the violence, to find a way to coexist. The commission had the authority to enforce such orders, and both Joe and the Gallos nominally agreed to comply. But the peace was fragile and based more on exhaustion than genuine reconciliation. Joe Profaci died on June 6, 1962, at his home in Brooklyn. He was 64 years old. The official cause of death was cancer, though the stress of the war with the Gallos had certainly contributed to his decline. Joe died without having completely defeated the rebellion, though his faction had inflicted serious damage on the gallows and maintained control of most of the family's operations. Joe's funeral was a massive affair, reflecting his dual identity as both mob boss and respected community figure. Hundreds of people attended, including family, members, friends, business associates, politicians, and religious leaders. The church where the funeral was held was packed. Priests presided over the service, praising Joe's generosity and his devotion to his family and faith. There was no mention, of course, of his criminal career. The procession to the cemetery was enormous, with dozens of cars following the hearse. Police were present to manage traffic and to observe who attended. Law enforcement used mob funerals as intelligence-gathering opportunities, photographing attendees and noting who was there. But the sheer size of Joe's funeral testified to the respect he commanded, both in the legitimate world where he'd cultivated his image and in the criminal world where he'd been a boss for 3 decades. Joe's will revealed the extent of his wealth. Despite spending lavishly on religious donations and maintaining an expensive lifestyle, he'd accumulated millions of dollars in assets. His legitimate businesses were worth substantial amounts. He owned real estate in New York and in Florida, where he'd purchased property during the 1950s. He had investments in various ventures. For a man who'd arrived in America with nothing, he'd achieved remarkable financial success. But Joe's real legacy was the criminal organization he'd built. The Profaci family, which would later be renamed the Colombo family under different leadership, was one of New York's 5 families. It controlled rackets worth millions of dollars annually, had hundreds of made members and associates, and had influence throughout Brooklyn and beyond. Joe had taken a small crew and built it into a major criminal organization. Joe's death didn't end the Gallo-Profaci conflict. If anything, it intensified for a time. Joseph Magliocco succeeded Joe as boss and continued the war against the gallows. The violence persisted through the early 1960s, eventually subsiding not through reconciliation but through mutual exhaustion and commission pressure. Historians and crime writers have debated Joe Profaci's legacy extensively. On one hand, he was undeniably a successful mob boss who ran a profitable criminal organization for decades while avoiding serious legal consequences. He died free, wealthy, and surrounded by family, which is more than most mob bosses could say. Many ended up dead in the streets or spending their final years in prison. Joe was also innovative in his integration of legitimate business with criminal activity. The olive oil importing company wasn't just a front. It was a real business that made real money while also serving criminal purposes. This model of hiding criminal operations inside functioning legitimate businesses became standard practice in organized crime. On the other hand, Joe's greed and his excessive demands for tribute created the resentments that led to the Gallo Rebellion. A more generous boss, one who shared wealth more freely with his soldiers and showed more respect for their contributions, might have avoided that internal conflict. The war damaged the family, created opportunities for rivals, and drew law enforcement attention that persisted for years. Joe's public persona as a religious, charitable businessman was also somewhat hypocritical. He gave generously to the church while making money through extortion, loan sharking, and other activities that hurt people. His donations were essentially laundering his reputation, buying respectability with money earned through crime. The church's willingness to accept those donations without asking hard questions about their source enabled this hypocrisy. But Joe probably wouldn't have seen it that way. In his worldview, he was a man who'd succeeded in a difficult world through intelligence, hard work, and understanding how systems really worked. He'd provided for his family, helped his community, and lived according to values he believed were right. The fact that American law classified his activities as criminal was just an inconvenience, not a moral judgment he accepted. Joe's children and grandchildren inherited his wealth but not his criminal empire. Some went into legitimate business, using the money Joe had accumulated to build legal enterprises. Others wanted nothing to do with anything connected to organized crime, changing their names and distancing themselves from the Profaci legacy. This was common in mob families. The second and third generations often wanted to escape the criminal world and live normal lives. The Profaci family itself continued under different leadership after Joe's death. Joseph Magliocco's tenure as boss was brief and troubled. He was involved in a plot to assassinate other mob bosses and was forced to step down. The family was then taken over by Joseph Colombo, who gave it his name. Under Colombo, the family survived and even thrived for a time, though it faced ongoing challenges from the remnants of the Gallo faction and from law enforcement. Joe Profaci's story illustrates the arc of many first-generation Italian-American mobsters. They arrived as immigrants in a country that offered opportunity but also discrimination and limited options. They turned to crime as a path to prosperity, building organizations that operated in the shadows while trying to maintain respectability in the legitimate world. They accumulated wealth and power, but at enormous moral and sometimes personal cost. After Joe Profaci's death, the organization he'd built faced an uncertain future. Joseph Magliocco, who'd been Joe's underboss and brother-in-law, assumed control of the family. But Magliocco lacked Joe's strategic mind and political skills. Where Joe had been calculating and patient, Magliocco was impulsive and paranoid. Where Joe had maintained careful relationships with other mob families, Magliocco saw enemies and conspiracies everywhere. The ongoing conflict with the Gallo faction consumed much of Magliocco's attention. The Gallos hadn't been defeated by Joe's death. If anything, they saw it as an opportunity. With the old boss gone, maybe they could negotiate better terms or even seize control of the family. Larry Gallo and Joey Gallo continued their operations, refusing to fully submit to Magliocco's authority, maintaining their independent territory in Brooklyn. But Magliocco made a catastrophic error that would doom his tenure as boss. In 1963, he became involved in a plot with Joseph Bonanno, boss of another of the 5 families, to assassinate several other mob bosses including Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese. The plot was discovered before it could be executed, and when the commission learned about it, they were furious. The commission had been established specifically to prevent this kind of internecine warfare between families. Bosses weren't supposed to try to kill each other. Disputes were supposed to be settled through negotiation and commission mediation. Magliocco's involvement in an assassination plot against other bosses was a fundamental violation of the rules that had kept the peace between families for 3 decades. Magliocco was called before the commission to answer for his actions. Facing the possibility of being killed himself, he claimed he'd been manipulated by Bonanno, that he hadn't really wanted to go through with the plot. He pleaded for mercy, offering to step down as boss if the commission would spare his life. The commission agreed, perhaps influenced by Magliocco's health. He was seriously ill with heart disease and wasn't expected to live much longer anyway. Magliocco stepped down in late 1963 and died just a few months later in December. His tenure as boss had lasted only about a year and a half, and he'd managed to disgrace himself and damage the family's reputation with the other families. The organization that Joe Profaci had carefully built over 3 decades had been weakened significantly in just 18 months under Magliocco's leadership. The commission had to decide who would take over the Profaci family. The obvious choice would have been one of the senior capos who'd been loyal to Joe Profaci. But the commission wanted someone who could end the conflict with the Gallos, who could restore stability to the family, and who would be acceptable to the other bosses. They chose Joseph Colombo, a relatively young capo who was seen as capable and who had good relationships across the family. Colombo's elevation to boss marked a new era for the family. He eventually gave the family his own name. It became known as the Colombo family rather than the Profaci family. This was partly practical. There needed to be a clear break from the turmoil of the Magliocco period. But it also reflected the reality that Joe Profaci's legacy was complicated. Yes, he'd built the family and run it successfully for decades. But the resentments he'd created through his greed and the conflict with the Gallos had damaged the organization. Under Colombo's leadership, the family worked to end the conflict with the Gallos. It wasn't easy. Too much blood had been spilled. Too many grudges existed. But through a combination of negotiation, strategic violence against the most intransigent Gallo supporters, and simple exhaustion on both sides, an uneasy peace was established by the mid-1960s. The criminal operations that Joe Profaci had established continued to generate income for the family. The loan sharking, gambling, labor racketeering, and other rackets persisted. New leadership meant some reorganization, some shifting of territories and responsibilities, but the fundamental business model remained the same. The family was still involved in the garment industry, still controlled certain unions, still operated illegal gambling operations. The legitimate businesses that Joe had built also continued. The olive oil importing company and other food businesses remained profitable. Real estate holdings generated rental income. These legitimate enterprises provided both income and continued cover for criminal activities, just as Joe had intended. But the landscape was changing. Law enforcement pressure on organized crime continued to intensify through the 1960s. The FBI was using sophisticated surveillance techniques, building longer-term cases, targeting entire criminal organizations rather than just individual criminals. The days when mob bosses could operate with relative impunity were ending. Joe Profaci's strategy of maintaining a legitimate public profile while running criminal operations behind the scenes became harder to sustain. Law enforcement and media were better at exposing the connections between supposedly legitimate businessmen and organized crime. The protective cover that legitimate business provided was eroding. The Italian-American community was also changing. The second and third generations were largely leaving the old neighborhoods, getting educations, entering professions, assimilating into mainstream American society. The insular ethnic communities where the mafia had thrived were disappearing. Younger Italian Americans didn't want to be associated with organized crime. They found it embarrassing, a negative stereotype they were trying to overcome. This made recruitment more difficult for mob families. In Joe's era, becoming a made member of a mafia family was seen by some young men as an achievement, a path to respect and prosperity. By the 1960s and 70s, more young Italian-American men saw organized crime as a dead end, something to avoid rather than aspire to. The pool of potential recruits was shrinking. Joe Profaci's legacy lived on in the structure and operations of the family that bore his name for 3 decades and then bore Colombo's name. The rackets he'd established, the territories he'd controlled, the methods he'd developed. All of these continued to shape the family's operations long after his death. His approach to integrating legitimate business with criminal activity became standard practice throughout organized crime. Other mob families copied the model of hiding criminal operations inside functioning legitimate businesses. Joe had understood something crucial, that the best cover for criminal activity wasn't isolation and secrecy, but integration with the legitimate economy. Joe's relationship with the Catholic Church also set a pattern. Other mob bosses followed his example of making substantial charitable donations to churches and religious organizations, buying respectability and goodwill in their communities. The church's willingness to accept money from questionable sources created a symbiotic relationship that benefited both sides, even if it raised moral questions that were rarely addressed directly. The internal conflict that marked Joe's final years also had lasting effects. The Gallo Rebellion demonstrated that even the most established mob boss could face challenges from within his own organization. Loyalty couldn't be taken for granted. Excessive greed and disrespect for subordinates could create resentments that exploded into violence. Future mob bosses learned from Joe's experience, though many would make similar mistakes. Joe Profaci's grandchildren and great-grandchildren grew up knowing about their ancestors' criminal career, though the details were often softened or romanticized. To them, Joe was a complicated figure. On one hand, he'd provided the wealth and opportunities that had given them comfortable lives. On the other hand, his criminal activities had created a legacy that was sometimes embarrassing or burdensome. Some family members embraced the Profaci name and the history that came with it. Others distanced themselves, changed their names, tried to build identities separate from the criminal legacy. This split in how the family dealt with Joe's legacy reflected the broader Italian-American experience, caught between pride in their heritage and discomfort with the organized crime stereotype. The physical assets Joe had accumulated were distributed, according to his will and eventually through subsequent inheritance. The house in Brooklyn was sold. The Florida properties were divided among heirs. The legitimate businesses were either sold or continued under family management, gradually losing their connection to criminal activity as new generations took control. The olive oil company, which had been so central to Joe's operation, eventually passed out of family control. It continued as a business, but without the Profaci name attached and without any connection to organized crime. It became just another food importing company, its history as a mob front forgotten by most people. Law enforcement continued to investigate Joe Profaci's operations even after his death. Federal prosecutors were interested in understanding how he'd run his organization, how he'd hidden criminal income, how he'd maintained his operations for so long without being successfully prosecuted. Files were compiled, witnesses were interviewed, financial records were analyzed. But Joe had been careful throughout his career. He'd avoided leaving evidence, had insulated himself from direct involvement in crimes, had maintained the facade of legitimacy. Even years after his death, investigators found it difficult to definitively prove many of the criminal activities they suspected he'd been involved in. His caution and strategic thinking had protected him not just during his life but even afterward. The final assessment of Joe Profaci's life and legacy requires understanding the world he inhabited and the choices he made within it. He arrived in America in 1921 as a young immigrant with no money, no connections outside the criminal underworld, and limited legitimate opportunities. The path he chose, organized crime, was one that many Italian immigrants considered and some pursued, though most found other ways forward. Joe succeeded where many failed because he understood something fundamental about sustainable criminal enterprise. It wasn't enough to be tough or willing to use violence. Those qualities were common in the underworld. What set Joe apart was his ability to build systems, to create structures that generated income reliably while minimizing risk. The integration of legitimate business with criminal operations wasn't just clever, it was visionary for its time. His 3 decades as boss of a New York crime family represented remarkable longevity in a world where violent death and imprisonment were common endpoints. Joe died in his own bed, surrounded by family, having avoided the fate that befell so many mobsters. This wasn't luck. It was the result of careful planning, strategic thinking, and an understanding of when to fight and when to avoid confrontation. But Joe's success came at tremendous cost, both to others and ultimately to himself. The people who borrowed money from his loan sharks and couldn't repay faced violence and ruin. The workers in industries his family controlled were exploited. The businesses forced to pay extortion had their profits drained. Joe built his fortune on the suffering of others, however much he rationalized it as simply how the world worked. The internal rebellion led by the gallows revealed the weakness in Joe's approach. His excessive demands for tribute, his failure to share wealth generously with his soldiers, his imperious leadership style. All of these created resentments that eventually exploded into violence. A wiser leader might have recognized that loyalty must be earned and maintained, that taking care of your people is an investment in stability, not an expense to be minimized. The final years of Joe's life, consumed by illness and internal war, were far from the peaceful culmination he'd probably imagined. Instead of enjoying his wealth and watching his grandchildren grow up, he spent his last months orchestrating violence against rebels within his own organization, his body failing even as he refused to compromise or forgive. Joe Profaci's story is ultimately a tragedy, though not in the classical sense. He achieved his goals, accumulated wealth and power, and built an organization that survived him. But the achievement was hollow. The wealth was built on exploitation and crime. The power was exercised in service of enriching himself at others' expense. The organization he built would eventually face the same fate as all criminal enterprises, dismantled by law enforcement, weakened by internal conflicts, made irrelevant by changing social conditions. His legacy in the Italian-American community is complicated. To some, he represents the dark side of the immigrant experience, the choice to pursue prosperity through crime rather than through legitimate means. To others, he's a reminder of a time when Italian Americans faced discrimination and limited opportunities, when organized crime seemed like a rational response to a society that offered them little. The Colombo family, as the Profaci family came to be known, continued for decades after Joe's death, though with diminishing power and influence. Federal prosecutions in the 1980s and 90s, using RICO statutes and testimony from cooperating witnesses, decimated the family's leadership. The rackets Joe had established were disrupted or eliminated. The era of mob dominance over various industries ended. Today, Joe Profaci is remembered primarily through books and documentaries about organized crime history. His name appears alongside other mob bosses from New York's five families, a significant figure in the development of American organized crime. The olive oil importing business that had been his cover is mentioned as an example of how mobsters hid criminal operations inside legitimate enterprises. But beyond the historical footnotes and true crime accounts, Joe Profaci's life poses questions that remain relevant. How do we judge someone who achieved success through criminal means? How do we balance acknowledgement of the limited opportunities available to immigrants with condemnation of the choice to pursue crime? How do we assess a legacy that includes both genuine business achievement and systematic exploitation? Joe Profaci lived by a code he believed was honorable loyalty to family, respect for tradition, adherence to mafia principles. But that code coexisted with activities that harmed countless people. The contradiction was never resolved, and Joe died probably believing he'd lived a good life according to the values he held dear. In the end, Joe Profaci was a product of his time and circumstances who made choices that brought him wealth and power but also brought suffering to others and ultimately consumed his final years in conflict and illness. His story is not one to be celebrated but to be understood as a cautionary tale about the true cost of the criminal path, regardless of how successfully it's pursued. He built an empire on sand, and though it stood for decades, it was always destined to crumble. The legitimate businesses he created survived, but separated from the criminal enterprise. The family name he passed down carried a burden as much as a legacy. And the man himself, for all his success, died having betrayed the very values of loyalty and honor he claimed to cherish, his organization at war with itself, his body racked with disease. Joe Profaci's American dream was achieved, but it was a nightmare for many others. That is his true legacy, a reminder that success gained through exploitation and crime, however carefully managed and disguised, remains fundamentally corrupt, and the price is paid not just by the victims but eventually by the perpetrators themselves.